That access production step took me about an hour. Why? Well, the tension levels. The U.S.-Japanese tension boiled over to 10 with the modifier, which means the Japanese immediately must mobilize, and that pushed it up another one. And we chose not to mobilize the shipyard. We've got a bunch of air units. Well, no, we've got those already in play. We've got a bunch of naval air, so we didn't mobilize that either. We mobilized some air units and some ground units. The reason is we don't want to push the tensions up with the shipbuilding. It would be helpful to be able to spend more points on shipbuilding, but you know, we do that, and the U.S. is able to bump up its own advantages as well, and it increases the tensions. So there's no real desire to push the U.S. towards the war. I may end up having to go to the shipbuilding. I did lay down another carrier, though, and I built another one, which means the U.S. can actually lay down 2 more big carriers. I did a big one, again, because I think the tensions, it's going to take a while for the U.S. to come into the war. Both Russian and U.S. tensions also went up. The U.S. is very close to another mobilization themselves. If they hadn't gotten a lousy die roll on the random variants, they would have gotten that. The Russians... I charged the Russians for expansion into East Poland. That happened... It's not clear from Gathering Storm when that happens, but to me, logically, it happened when the Germans moved in there, but it doesn't grant it to them. So it's either happening this turn or it has already happened, so they should get the penalty for it. They're going to make their choice in terms of the Baltic states, whether or not they want to grab them, and I got to try to figure out where exactly that border is somehow. I'm probably going with the river because Riga is part of Lithuania, and I think the river line may be the border between the three. Okay, I had to find, and this was kind of tricky, Italian-German restrictions, and there's no index for them, but I knew they existed. The Germans can't move into Italian territory until Italy's in the war, which means I have to set up purely Italian forces to go into Egypt. I didn't need the Italians to go into France. I don't think I want to declare war until I shift some forces down into Libya for that fight. The Germans had the problem of they have no air transport for their paratroopers. Technological oops. That means, do I really want Denmark? Well, I haven't set up as though I do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But I could take it anyway next turn. I'm kind of trying to figure out what I want to take, what I don't want to take. Move against Serbia would be nice to get those 10 BRPs. I'm kind of short on money for the Germans, but I did notice something weird. So the initial setup for Gathering Storm, and this may be changed in the errata for that game, but I'm not worried about it. Gives you packed value only for things you conquered. Maybe I'm misreading it, but that's what I've got written down at this point. And, you know, so Germany got $5 for Poland. Well, they also got 5 for this, but that's built into their BRP, their base, instead of the 20 that they should have, that they would have, and will next year. And same with Italy, 5 for Greece instead of the 10 they would have. On the other hand, I threw them extra money for like Albania, that, you know, because it was pre-written on the sheet for the 39 situation. So I don't know how that's supposed to go. So we may be shorting the axis by a few BRPs. Hey, no big deal, right? The Germans tried to actually limit their building. I still built like 80-something points of units, including my naval build, because it's really hard not to build the stuff you have. But with that big growth ratio, it would be nice to have those BRPs in my industry early on. So I'm probably not going to build any more units in the next move. The Japanese mobilization also means the U.S. had a mobilization triggered. Theirs is kind of interesting. They're not allowed to build armor with their Pacific mobilizations, but they can build these motorized or mechanized infantry, and I built one of them, planning on sending that west, planning on sending these air units west, but I did also build up my naval air, which, you know, I have a bunch of ships coming that I don't have naval air for. I'd like to get that out of the way. And we'll see how that goes. And now we move on to the Allied side of the turn. One of the viewers, maybe the same one as before, who's been correcting me, etc., raised some issues, and I have to admit I've got concerns about whether it's right or not. My unflipping of air units. However, the only way that I can justify all the different rules that are in different places and seem semi-contradictory if you don't really take them all as a whole is the way I did it, which is that you get to unflip your air units for free at the beginning and end of your turn, and that you can pay to unflip them during your turn, except in some special cases where you're restricted to not be allowed to unflip until the end of the turn. Naval units very clearly work that way, but air units, there's a little bit more wiggle room to try to argue that they do not. Anyway, let's get started with the Western Allies. They're gonna pick their diplomacy targets, or target. Well, and the Russians, but the Russians are kind of playing a defensive game. If we end up not seeing the Germans go into Romania, we may trigger that because, hey, maybe we have a slight advantage there. But for the Allies, how do they feel about these? Do they want to take a chance? Do they want to hold off? This is the question. The US one's free. I think I'll fire that off. But what about Sweden and or Spain? I probably am better off not using that at this point. In either case, I may be tipping my hand too much by showing them. We don't know what Germany's got planned for us. So similar to the Russians, I think we're going to hold them on defensive. The Germans have a lot of dip points. We don't know what they're doing. I don't actually know how the US dip works. So let's see. I'll go check the rules on that and be back. It turns out that they're expended 1 per turn maximum. I'll drop this down to a 2. And they simply add in to the tensions up here on a 1-for-1 basis. So we add 1 to the tensions, and we're going to be going up to 37 actual, 35. 35 is important because that, I think, triggers another U.S. mobilization, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe I am. We don't know. Triggers something, I think. U.S. mobilizes another 20 points of units, including CVEs using American naval air training. I'm allowed to construct British CVEs, but I'd rather construct U.S. ones. And I can deploy both ASW counters that I have, and I do have only 2, against the Axis. So we'll be able to start hunting subs if they put them out. They haven't put them out yet. All right. So that's actually triggered right away. Done a little bit of sea transport, bolstering the forces here in Egypt. It's really beginning to look like the Italians aren't going to want to attack in Egypt. It's just a matter of, I don't have all that much force here. The problem, of course, is if I don't declare war on the Brits, I could end up in an ugly situation, because if the US enters the war before Italy declares war, Italy can never declare war. On the other hand, maybe the Brits will declare war and go storming into Libya. There's not a lot I can do about that. I'm kind of looking at, well, what do I want to do? Do I want to move my Italian infantry and armor down into Libya. Not that this is the Italian turn. Anyway, those U.S. force or those Allied forces have been moved some task force out into the Western Atlantic. And I haven't really been counting the transports. They should be getting charged for this. So for example, sailing up to the Mediterranean, the Germans can't intercept from that distance. I think I don't know what it is. It may be like 40 hexes, so they actually have a shot. But they could be counter-intercepted by the forces at Scapa Flow. It's just not worth it. The Italians aren't at war, so the Brits are able to land some Canadians here in Alexandria, and they pull some Aussies and South Africans into Alexandria. Into Suez, really kind of bolstering the force. On the French side of things, I don't think there's a damn thing I can do. I have 2, 4, 6, 7, 8 strength points. If I go 1, 2, 3, and I don't think I can get these 4 or these 2 into play. I could use the British air power in here. So we were looking at 2, 4, 6, 4, 8, 9, 10, 13 strength points total, assuming that I don't get stopped, with counter air, which I would. There's plenty of Germans within range, against 16 points of armor. I can't get 1-to-1 odds, which is the requirement to attack with the French. They're not allowed to attack anything but Paris unless it's able to allow an attack into Paris, basically, that couldn't otherwise be done at the odds that it would be done. So basically, France is hosed, and they're going to surrender, and we're really just kind of looking at, well, what can we do to save the English? And this is a real shame, because the French Navy is very important. I was counting on them holding out, actually, or hoping they would, because the Brits only have 1 5-factor battleship that they're allowed to build for the entire span of the game, because the French research into the battleships was the big deal on their side. So France is going to fall, and they're not going to give anything over, and it's going to be an ugly situation. Of course, the U.S. can build 5-factor battleships, just like the Japanese can. Not much that I can do over here. I'm pretty much locked in with the U.S. I've got the Chinese to play with. That's about it. So I guess I'll take a look and see what I can do with the nationalist Chinese to try to protect this hole I've got here. So the Allied bomber here on the Western Front, I could commit that to bombing the Germans. I only think I have normal air range, which means 4 hexes from a base. Dusseldorf is the only, Cologne as well, 1, 2, 3, 4. I could hit either of them. But if I tried to do that, there's a ton of air power that can prevent me from getting there. They're allowed to intercept, and I have no interceptors of my own to escort them in for the bombing run, which means that I really don't want to do that. If the Germans didn't have, air units in the West, yeah, I might. The Germans can actually shift their air units up and do a Battle of Britain with them, and they will. They're not able to bomb everything, but they can get London and I think Birmingham with them. 1, 2, 3. They can get all the way to Manchester. So we may well see a Battle of Britain arising here. The next thing that we actually hit that's of importance, and I handled the Japanese attack, the Chinese attack on the Japanese, minor, just 2 Japanese units lost, nothing happening with those units in the mountains. It's a fairly weak line that the Chinese are holding, though, and the Japanese may well be able to break through, say here or something. We'll see if they do an offensive to try to push things at Chongqing. But the hard question now is, do Vichy or not? You have the choice in this to create Vichy or not. Now, one of the questions that comes from that, Gathering Storm, if I calculate by the rules of Gathering Storm, or A World at War for that matter, I end up with a Vichy surrender level of French surrender level of -1. Unfortunately, both of them have a fixed date for the French resistance to surrendering, as though the French immediate collapse that we saw here, that was so fast upon upon being declared war, wouldn't have the same psychological effect that it would that it did historically in 40, right? Well, what the game does is it sets you at if it's 40 or earlier, you get +2, spring 40 or earlier. No modification in the summer, and in the fall of 40 or winter of 40 or later, it goes to -2 or -4. So we'd be at a -4 to that surrender level, which would put us to a -1. And that's going to be bad for Germany. We'll see why. But the question really sits in my head of, does that even make sense? I mean, Germany has been running rampant here, and then boom, we declare war on France. This may be a game balance mechanism in play, but I kind of feel like France would collapse just as easily if the war started in spring of 41 and the first thing that happened was the Germans streaked into Paris. I'm very reticent towards giving them that -1 position. So what are the effects if it happens? Well, shift my paperweight here. So if I declare Vichy and it's a +3, there will be no Free French created. Well, there'll be no Free French created at all. On the other hand, there'll be, if Vichy is established and we're at -1, we'll get 6 strength points of infantry and a cruiser and a destroyer that escape. Now, if no Vichy is declared, there would be 3 strength points of infantry that are taken by the Free French, and if I'm at -1, it's 9 strength points of infantry, a couple army air factors, and a named ship, and this, that, and the other. So there's definitely a reason to create Vichy, to prevent the Free French from becoming stronger. Also, if the Vichy are created, how big they are is determined by that table. Okay, so then the other question is, well, if I create Vichy, I get Vichy France, which is worth, I think, 20 BRPs for Marseille and Lyon, in addition to Paris, which is worth 20 on its own. So I would get a full 40 BRPs of conquered territory if I just absorb Vichy France. If I don't absorb, and Germany's got some problems here, because Croatia is not going to be conquered, Greece is not going to be conquered. So that's 20 points that the Germans aren't going to get into their pocket. Some of it's Italian, some of it's Croatian. So I might be poor enough that I want Vichy. The other side of it, though, is it is conceivable that I could diplomatically align Vichy France to the Axis to the extent, historically I think they sent some troops to Russia, but to the extent that they actually just declare themselves in the war. And then I get a 20-point minor country and the entire Vichy force pool added to the German force pool. That's sort of a dream situation, though. That's going to be hard to reach. They have on the diplomatic table, it's tough to make that. However, I have good diplomacy already throughout most of East Europe, just because of what happened in Gathering Storm. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to say we're at the +3 basis, because I just don't buy the French fall like that is. And I'm probably, unbalancing the game by doing this, but this is just, I feel like these sandboxes, I have to be able to use some reason on them to see how rational the situation turns out. So I don't feel like the year should count against the French. I might accelerate the effects, like if the French had lasted one turn, I'd give them, the neutral value as opposed to a slight penalty, the penalty still. If I had taken longer than that, the penalty would accrue more quickly than it would in 39. But I just don't buy that France's psychology wouldn't be affected by this hit, which means there will be no free French forces if I establish it. And if I don't establish it, I'll get a few strength points. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to establish Vichy France with the hope of being able to devote a lot of our diplomacy into it and prevent the Germans from or be able to bring them on board. Now, there was something else. Okay, I don't remember what it was, but yeah, we'll allocate the Vichy French as indicated here. Oh yeah, where the colonies go. So we have created a Vichy France, so we'll roll at a +3 on the die roll. Yeah, it's the French surrender level +3. So basically, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, and Lebanon, Syria both become Vichy French colonies. Lebanon, Syria historically did not. Everything in the Pacific, French Indochina becomes its own little minor state, which the Japanese can screw with. That's going to happen no matter what. And the Pacific French islands become Free French, and they've got no troops in them, but they support the British. So that's what we're going to see as our situation. And I think that's probably the most fair. So I'll set that sucker up. The alternative would be to grab those extra BRPs, but I think I've got more diplomacy than I should. So what the heck, right? A little bit of redeployment that happens, French forces moving into here. They have to go out to the colonies, to every capital. And these units weren't constructed, but I believe they stick around for rebuilds. And the only reason I would do that is because it mentions that maybe they're supposed to be on the map, but that the fleets are allowed to continue building. Not sure about the ones in Lorient. I'll have to look them up. But as such, what I'm going to do is the Vichy French are going to rebuild their forces up to their 20 points. Using their 20 points of BRPs a turn a year to start constructing new units. And I'll just do it, as soon as possible. So right now they're not going to have 20. They're going to have some proportion of that. 3/4 of 20 sounds like 15 to me. That they'll be able to build their forces. They're going to do that though in the Axis turns, because they're semi-aligned with the Axis for now. Sort of. And that looks like about it. I've got some counters to put back from Gathering Storm. I'll take the rest of the fortifications down. The fortresses are gone. It's just a matter of what we've got. Now it's time to build the Allied units. Boy. Okay, I was finally able to find, and I was wrong about those air units, so France probably wouldn't have been as easy a fall as it was. 18.42 says that air units performing an air mission are inverted for the remainder of the player turn. So there are some things that can cause them to invert, I guess, where you can uninvert them in the midst of the turn. I'm not sure what those are, but it's not playing out an action. And indeed, you do have to pay at the beginning or end of your turn with oil. That might be oil, you get 25 free BRPs turned over if you negate the normal air oil effect. By the way, there's these little oil effect cards, which I guess are used to mark your penalization for that. Oops. You know, this is a tough rule book to cope with. It really is. So, anyway, my apologies for the mistake, but I think we're done with the Spring 41 turn. And I've got some more force pulls. I built some more units, SR'd some stuff. We got some more armor over here in Port Said. And Britain's looking pretty undefended, but I feel pretty confident about the British Navy. There's a couple of ground units there. I just don't think the Germans can force it on their own. I've got a fair-sized Navy in the Mediterranean, though, probably a little bigger than it should be. I was unable to build any CVEs. I just don't have the shipyard capacity in the U.S., and I don't really have the points. They can only be built in the U.S. anyway. But I built up my transports. Britain's been taking a penalty, or took a penalty this turn, because they don't start with enough transports. They don't in the base game either. They have to get some out there. I have built my entire force pool of transports, and I'm still going to be taking a penalty. I've got to start developing that transport research. I think I've got some points in it, though, so we should be able to fire some of that off. I probably should have been able to do it now, because it doesn't count against your research roll, but I can't track everything properly. Anyway, I guess we'll send this one up. It's real short compared to the first part of this turn, but I want to end at a turn end. I don't want to. I'm going to jump through somewhat more quickly as we go. One thing I forgot to mention, I didn't bother with the Russians. They declared war and moved into Estonia and Latvia. They haven't captured them yet. The forests here made it impossible for them to move quickly enough. If I had some armor or something, they could have. I have armor, it's just I didn't have it in the right place. Not a huge deal. It just means they'll be getting the money for those a little later. So they'll be getting $10, which pays, well, prorated, which more or less pays off the cost of the declaration of war. I gotta look. That's going to affect Russian-German tensions. It may also affect U.S. Axis tensions. They're not going to get Lithuania, which are just going to make everything south of the river. I'm not positive. And that's going to be just this free 5-point area. I don't know whether or not they can declare war on Lithuania. Because it's not part of the pact. I think once tensions get high enough, they're allowed to start a war there. I'm not sure how valuable that is, though. I want to grab the money while I've got it, throw it into my base for growth, and see what comes of that. All right, let's send this one up.